Vanessa Beeley, a highly regarded independent journalist who has been in Syria for a number of years, reporting there courageously. Vanessa, since you have been there, been on the ground, were there for the recent actions that seem to shock the world, I would like to give the floor to you to tell us what happened and your perspective on the situation there.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me on to explain what has been happening. Because, yeah, there has been a tsunami of misinformation regarding the entire situation. Very much a blame game, blaming different factions for betrayal and for surrender and so on. So I think it's important to clarify. First of all, I think it's important to put context that Syria since 2011 has been the target of US, UK, Gulf state, Israeli, Turkish-led regime change war, which included the invasion of the country by various terrorist factions, some of which were incubated in Iraq by the United States, like Nusra Front and ISIS, others that are made up of foreign extremist mercenaries also operating alongside the indigenous groups that have been fostered, armed, funded, and equipped by the West and their allies. And so for the last 14 years, Syria has been fighting this war. Since 2020, it had, let's say, reached a stage of stagnation where 3/4 of Syria's borders were effectively occupied by hostile states and their proxy forces. So from the northwest to the northeast, down to the southeast, the south, and the only really friendly border was with Lebanon, that of course itself has recently been under attack by Israel and the United States. And so therefore, for some time we had known, especially since the Israeli genocide began in Palestine, in Gaza on October the 7th, and has continued since then. We knew that there was at some point going to be an attack, particularly from the northwest, which is Idlib of Syria, which is, as Brett McGurk described it, the largest al-Qaeda haven since 9/11. Those forces have been fostered, as I said, by the United States and their allies, including Gulf states, more recently by Turkey, and then by Ukraine. Ukraine special forces have been in the northwest of Syria training, arming, and equipping these groups and giving them specifically drone technology that they didn't have before, in return for Abu Muhammad Jolani, the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which was formerly Nusra Front, and Jolani was formerly ISIS, of course, when he first entered Syria. Jolani has been sending militants from his groups to Ukraine to fight against Russia in return for the technology and weapons given to them by Ukraine. So for about 3 months, we had been aware that there was potential of an attack from the northwest. At the same time as Israel and Lebanon agreed on a ceasefire, at that time, we all knew that that was time for Netanyahu to pivot towards Syria to destroy, during the ceasefire, to destroy the weapons supply lines from Iran, Iraq, through Syria and into Lebanon, but also to destroy Syria's capability of producing and manufacturing weapons that were also being supplied to the resistance factions in Lebanon and Palestine. And at this point, I think it was hours after the ink dried on the ceasefire agreement, the attack began from the northwest, from Idlib, by the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham coalition. The first city to be attacked was Aleppo. There were sleeper cells already in Aleppo that were triggered to start, let's say, spreading panic among Syrian people by appearing on video in the center of the city and desecrating statues and so on. But we knew at that point that the main body of the terrorist forces hadn't yet entered Aleppo. There were 30,000 Syrian army forces stationed in and around Aleppo. They withdrew, apart from in the east, where one particular Syrian army brigade remained in situation. From the reports that I've heard, at that point, Sergei Kessel, who was then the commander of the Russian forces in Syria, he withdrew his forces to Haimamim, leaving the one Syrian army brigade to fight alone in the east of Aleppo. They then came down to the south and they released some of the people from the Shia Muslim towns of Nubal and Zara, who had managed to evacuate but had been trapped in the southern area of Aleppo alongside other civilians and military cadets. So they were freed. And then the snowball effect was extraordinary. There was a lot of miscommunication. There were a lot of reports that Syrian Army Command were not able to communicate with their forces. So there was a lot of confusion on the battlefield. The next city to fall was Hama, although the terrorists were held back in northern Hama, which is the area of many of the Orthodox Christian Syrian towns, or that basically held back the terrorist forces for some time. And then basically it accelerated from Hama onwards. So when they arrived in Homs, there were Hezbollah forces and Iranian forces and Syrian army forces that stood their ground, but in the end had to capitulate because other members of the Syrian army surrendered. We were then told that there was potential for a deal where President Assad would remain in power for at least 6 months to hand over to a transitional government. We were told that there would be some kind of ceasefire brokered by the backers of the terrorist groups. So at this point, it's Turkey, Israel, and the United States and Qatar that were involved in engineering these attacks. And then literally that night, the terrorists arrived in the outskirts of Damascus. Israel started bombing with bunker buster bombs the Syrian army air defense units, which were very close to where I live. And by the morning, it became clear that Damascus had also basically fallen. So for me, at that point, the border was closed, but with an excellent driver, a very brave driver, I managed to get through the border and into Lebanon.
I saw, the footage that you see here in the US is CNN journalists, the New York Times journalists running around with these terrorists. In fact, the one thing I saw was the terrorists liberating the prison, and the CNN anchor woman was hugging the people who were getting released and offering them comfort. So either of you or both of you may want to answer what on earth is up with the US media. I would suspect this is not an accurate picture of the warm, fuzzy, cuddly HTS group.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to step in quickly about Clarissa Ward. That's who you're talking about, is CNN. And I think pretty rapidly, at least 3 of her reports were completely debunked on social media in particular, but one where she was describing allegedly a Lebanese prisoner who, in fact, the people in the background were saying, no, he's not a prisoner. He's actually just come here for hospital treatment. Another one was a boy that they were interviewing who said he'd been in the prison for 14 years and he'd been born there. And when they asked how old he was, he said he was 10 years old. We're almost back to the scenarios in 2011 when Al Jazeera in particular, Qatar poured trillions into the regime change war, as actually admitted by, I think it was the foreign minister, I could have got that wrong, of Qatar. And Al Jazeera, being Qatari state media, was responsible for much of the propaganda in the early days and was swiftly followed up by CNN and BBC and Channel 4 and so on, and Sky News. And Arwa Damon, who was then the CNN journalist, I actually made a documentary with a Syrian filmmaker, Rafik Lutaf, called The Veto, which went into some depth about particularly Al Jazeera and Arwa Damon's literal theatrics. And I mean, it's proven that all of her reports were theatrical events, as of course were the chemical weapon attacks that followed after that, staged by the CIA MI6 funded and established White Helmet organization, embedded with the terrorist groups dominated by Al Qaeda, which is now Hayat Tahrir al Sham. And I guess the question that I have to ask, if there are so many legitimate atrocities committed by the Syrian government, why on earth is this necessity to fake them? If they exist, that you should be able to report on them without having to create this entire narrative complex that they're now basically returning to, all the journalists that are there. We're going back to pre-2012. The Sednaya story, which is the prison that you're talking about, was debunked back in 2016, 2017. Amnesty International then walked back its report because it was proven that the majority of the evidence had been AI generated, that they had not actually visited the prison. The former ambassador to Syria, Peter Ford, went on record saying that the description of Sednaya was ridiculous, that it was a much smaller prison than it is being described. Recently, the Syrian Civil Defense Organization has gone there and said there's nothing here. There are no tunnels, there are no extra rooms, there are no torture chambers, etc. And if you speak to the Christian, the nuns in the monastery of Sednaya, which is very close to Sednaya prison, they will tell you that the majority of the prisoners are the terrorists that tried to attack Sednaya and had, in that particular area, kidnapped nuns and priests from both Sednaya and from Malula. So for them, these were legitimate prisoners. But of course, the media is not going to talk to them. The media is not going to mention the prisons in Idlib that were being run by Jolani. They're not going to talk about the crimes and atrocities committed by Jolani and the extremist groups under his command, which include using child suicide bombers, exploiting child soldiers, etc., and many of the other issues that Senator Black has mentioned just now. None of that will be mentioned because the idea now is to further vilify and criminalize President Assad and his government, to create the kind of Holocaust narrative around his presidency, and to whitewash the terrorist groups that have been responsible for some of the worst atrocities in history against the Syrian people, and in particular against Christians and all minority religious communities and sects inside Syria. And I have interviewed many of the people that were under attack by those groups since 2012, 2013 in all areas of Syria.